So at UCLA, there was a little team of people. Len Kleinrock had the Network Measurement Center, but there were a group of graduate students who undertook to help plan what would happen. Stephen Crocker, who's my best friend and still is. John Postel, of course. I was there and participating in that. So there's a small group trying to figure out, well, what would you do if you had the ability to connect all these computers together somehow?
In the period between 69 and 71, it was experimental and people were trying things and doing things.
In 1971, email shows up, thanks to Ray Tomlinson at Bolt, Beranek and Newman. And that was really the first big smash hit.
Well, Ray Tomlinson did the initial work of having a program that would send a message with an address being something @ something. And so the @ came from Ray. But those programs were rather dysfunctional. So I wrote the program that just gave me the headers, and then I could read what I wanted, and I could forward it, and I could reply, and that sort of thing. And that made it much more usable.
Within a few weeks, it began to dominate the traffic on the network. And that's when I realized this is about people talking to each other and not about machines talking to each other.
By 1971, we had a whole collection of things that worked over the network. And I hired Bob Kahn out of BBN, where he had been working on the design of the switch, into ARPA so he could help. And he built up a big conference in Washington when we showed the world what this could really do.
This is the first International Conference on Computer Communications. It was held at the Washington Hilton Hotel in 1972. And we took over one of the ballrooms in the basement to actually carry out this public demonstration. So sort of everybody who had been involved in networking in those early days was camped out at the Washington Hilton Hotel for about a week, till late in the evenings and early in the mornings, and it was a happening.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm with radio. I do not want a refrigerator that is smarter than I am. And I certainly don't want it conspiring with the television to murder me in my sleep, which they probably would. So, our next panel is called the Irresponsible Internet. And sometimes, you know, that's a virtue. So I promise you, you will be getting a lot of wisdom and piss and vinegar from this next panel. It's moderated by Katie Hafner, who's written for Newsweek, The New Republic, The New York Times, and Esquire, and written a book about the origins of the internet. Fasten your seatbelts.
Okay, I see the chairs are pretty far apart, so we're going to ask people to do a Pete Buttigieg jog onto the stage. And the first I'm introducing is Eugene Volokh, who's a professor of law at UCLA, who has written extensively on the internet, First Amendment, and First Amendment law. Welcome, Eugene.
Thanks.
And next is Rick Wilson, who was one of the top Republican consultants in the country, producing groundbreaking data-driven ad campaigns until he broke with the party, famously, I might add, founded the Never Trump movement, and coined the phrase, "Everything Trump touches dies." Not that we have opinions or take stands, so welcome, Rick. Next is Judy Estrin, who is quite well known to a lot of you and is a computer science pioneer, a networking pioneer, and an executive, and she has these days grown particularly interested in the ways in which technology affect democracy, so we're going to be talking about that. And then last, but certainly not least, is I'm interviewing two people, or well, one person and a dog. It's Molly Burke, who is a YouTuber, a motivational speaker, and author. She is blind, and she brings with her her guide dog, Gallop. So welcome, Molly. So I'm hoping that this will be a mixture of upbeat, downbeat, sideways. And I'm going to start by asking in a specific order each of you to to address one question. This is going to be like speed dating. I'm going to give you like maximum 3 minutes to answer. So here's the question. What is the issue that you believe most passionately the internet needs to address? And let me actually clarify that. I'm not asking you to focus on underlying infrastructure, but on issues of content, such as ethics, free speech, extremism, hate speech, accessibility, and inclusiveness. So, Judy, you're up first.
Thank you. And I'm just going to take a minute of my time to thank Len. And it's so nostalgic being here at UCLA. My father started the computer science department, was mentioned this morning, grew up here. And I, on the panel when they were talking about testing between UCLA and Stanford, I did that testing for the internet. Vint was my professor between Stanford, BBN, and UCL. So my job was at 3 o'clock in the morning to do that kind of testing of the first packets over the internet. So it's wonderful to be here today. What I'm most passionate about, and it's actually what I'm spending most of my time doing today, is actually around the technological and cultural issues that we're seeing in what we call the internet today. I think about the philosophy that drove the internet that I knew and the web being about distributing power, being about interconnecting diversity, and about open systems. Open source is not the same thing as open systems. And today's environment is actually the antithesis of that. So I just want to take a couple of minutes, and I'm not going to be the upbeat part of this panel, and because I think we need to be aware and really thinking about these issues. So think about the words friction, disruption, and dominance. And if we were taking one of these polls that we're doing all day, are these good words or bad words? And my guess that most of you would say that friction is good, friction is bad, disruption is good, and dominance depends on whether you're the dominator or not. So let me talk first a minute about friction. One of the core tenets of the technology industry today, and maybe our lives, is make everything frictionless, have no barriers to growth. Human nature is to desire convenience, and we want to take the friction out of everything. But friction is critical. Friction, the right level of friction, is actually good. It takes friction to have human relationships and collaboration. Friction are the guardrails, the rules and norms that make society, democracy work, not to mention the impulse control to not send that tweet. It is friction which is the context and nuance that is behind understanding and trust. And if you can't tolerate discomfort, boredom, you'll never grow. So friction is a critical part of our lives. We're here because of friction. Let's talk about disruption. Well, the notion creative destruction has metastasized to be disruption of everything. But in many ways, network effects of discovery, the horizontal integration of discovering content, people, and services, is then leveraged to vertical integration or control of market after market after market. And that disrupts our trust, disrupts our, not just our notion of disrupting institutions, but the concept that an institution is even important. And in a winner-take-all market, success is no longer important, it's dominance. Scale fast, fail fast is good for VCs. It's good for large corporation. It is not good for broad-based innovation. It is not good for fair markets. And lastly, we are in a utopian vision of a frictionless society. We buy into this illusion of freedom, but we're actually being very tightly controlled. And the TV show Westworld is a simulation. We're not in a simulation, at least I don't believe so. And real people are getting hurt. So I believe in technology. I believe that we can reap the benefits, but not unless we acknowledge these deep structural problems. This is not about the internet fixing or the internet industry fixing it. It's about all of us. And if we're not willing to accept and even embrace some friction, we're not going to solve any of these problems.
Wow. Okay.
I told you I needed to get
Thank
it
you
out
for
after
that.
listening all morning. So
That was great. So Rick, that's you've got some shoes to fill there.
Well, you know, I'm normally Miss Mary Sunshine here, so I'm following that up. It's probably going to be a little more grim. I think the biggest concern that I have right now about the internet and a problem area we need to address is that we've got this system that is brilliantly optimized for politics, propaganda, and porn. And the latter we'll leave aside. But right now, we've seen how the internet has become very much weaponized to manipulate lower information voters, and higher information voters for that matter, in ways that are increasingly effective, increasingly driven by narrow but powerful AI, by large data sets that we didn't even imagine having in politics 10 or 20 years ago. And I think that we have reached a point where those tools are so powerful and so effective and so broadly based, and that the companies and institutions that are using those tools don't have a set of legal or regulatory or social or market forces pushing them to not allow them to be abused in ways that manipulate our elections or cause enormous social divisions, or that weaponize a lot of the the prejudices and the difficulties that we've had as a society over the years. And I am deeply concerned that we've reached a point where the technology has raced well ahead of the norms and institutions, much to say nothing of the ability of our leaders to understand it and to talk about it and to engage in ways that might mitigate some of these things, where you don't necessarily want the guy who can just afford to buy the greatest number of Facebook ads from his secret lair in Kraplokistan to buy the U.S. election. And we are reaching that point very quickly where all this has become so very effective and so very weaponized that I'm always one who follows where the markets go. And the markets in politics are now in the digital space. We used to run television ads. We used to run radio ads. We used to do all these other things in campaigns. But right now we're sort of approaching a point where not only the majority, but a meaningful majority of the spending will be on digital. And so this is an area that I think is enormously important that we address and think about and look for ways, not only in the regulatory and legal space, but in the market space, that get some of this in a situation where we have a little more perspective on what's driving our elections and our public opinion.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Molly, you're up, or do you want Gallup to speak to you?
Yeah, he unfortunately doesn't have much to say on this topic. I don't know if the color of my hair or my age has given it away, but I'm definitely like the least professional up here. I'm just like the simple YouTuber who posts videos online and somehow millions of people watch. But I think that's kind of part of the issue that I think needs to be addressed, is that it is still very much the Wild West in my industry. More millennials and children are watching YouTube than any other form of content. And YouTuber is the #1 job that kids say they want to be. And yet there is no like formal education around it. We don't have a union. There's nobody supporting us when the FTC comes out with new rules around sponsorship disclosure. Nobody tells us. It's just kind of up to us to figure it out. And then we get blamed if we do something wrong, but there's nobody supporting us. And we all get blamed under this umbrella of like bad YouTubers when one YouTuber does something wrong and gets press. And the reality is, I think parents need to be watching what their kids are watching, because anybody is posting anything. And not everybody has the moral compass of feeling responsible for being a role model, and they like to shrug off that responsibility. So I think that's one major issue. And the other, of course, that I have to mention as a blind user of the internet is lack of accessibility. I always say I'm very lucky to be a blind person in the 21st century because of technology. Mm-hmm. And it's empowered my community to have more access to information than ever before. But there are still so many internet websites that are not accessible. I have a series on my YouTube channel where I review online fashion companies as just a lover of fashion. And I also end up talking about how accessible or inaccessible those websites were for me to navigate to purchase my clothing. And you would be shocked at how many Fortune 500 companies, global recognized companies, have emailed me and been like, hey, could you just check out our website and let us know if it's accessible? And I'm like, you can hire consultants to do that. Like, that is somebody's actual job to help you make a website accessible. So yeah, those are probably the two biggest issues that I see as both a consumer user of the internet and somebody who makes a living posting content online.
Thank you. Eugene.
So the First Amendment famously protects the freedom of speech or of the press. And it protects them equally. It's right there, it's sort of the grammar treats them equally. And you look at the Supreme Court's cases with a few exceptions, basically what you can say, you can print, and vice versa. But if you look at the reality, the social technological reality of 50 years ago, freedom of speech was really something that everybody had. It could be spontaneous, it could be inexpensive, and it basically reached whoever was within sound of your voice. Maybe if you teamed up with some people to do a picket line or demonstration, you can reach more people that way. Freedom of the press, famously, A.J. Liebling said, freedom of the press belongs to him who owns one. So the ability to use mass communications was something that not by law, but by technological reality, was sharply limited to basically the rich and those who had the ear of the rich, those who the rich would allow to use their newspapers. If you want to talk about accessibility and if you want to talk about inclusion, that was a time when, because of technological constraints, the speech was accessible and inclusive in considerable measure. The press extraordinarily far from that for all but a tiny, tiny handful of people who had access to it. If you want to talk about weaponizing, a term I'm not wild about, in part because throughout the history of free speech in the press, of course it's been a political weapon. It was a political weapon of the labor movement, of the abolitionist movement, of anti-war movements. The whole reason that speech is protected is precisely so it could be a political weapon, in the sense of a tool for people to use to persuade others, sometimes by fair means, sometimes by foul, to do certain things. So you look at what the internet does, is the internet in many ways is the application of speech reality, past speech reality, to the press. Now, people can speak using the modern equivalent of the printing press to the public as a whole. Now, of course, it helps to be rich, always helps to be rich. But if you look at comparative accessibility and inclusion along a wide range of metrics, disability is one of them, wealth is the primary one, lots of others, it is a much more accessible and inclusive environment than ever before. People can speak more easily, more cheaply, more friction-free, for better or worse, than ever before. And we're not always happy about that. Why? Because freedom of speech, as well as of the press, has always been usable for good as well as for ill. It's always been usable to deceive as well as to inform. It's always been usable to spread bad ideas, evil ideas, as well as good ideas. The Supreme Court has had to deal with it. Society has had to deal with it. So I just want to caution us against thinking there's something sharply new, that now speech is being weaponized, or now the rich are taking over. Actually, the rich are less powerful, though, again, more powerful than the poor generally, but the comparative power, I think, is less than ever before. The weaponization is different, but it's the reality. It's the purpose, as I said, of free speech. So there's something I'm passionate about is for us just not to get too focused on this notion that somehow this creates a set of maladies that are new. What it does is it amplifies the natural human tendencies to say false things as well as true and believe false things as well as true. So if there's anything we can do, I think, is to try to figure out how we can deal with those tendencies for the internet as we had tried to do before.
Well, thank you. I had a follow-up for Rick, but Judy, you looked like you wanted to.
I just wanted to ask you a question. You don't think the scope and scale of connectivity now is different and sets up a different type of environment between being heard and speech? It
is different in that we used to basically silence people who did not have the wealth or the contacts. If you were the New York Times or if you were at ABC, you were able to speak to the world at large. If you happened to run a powerful advocacy group, you were able to speak to the world at large. And if you didn't, you couldn't. Now, as it happens, in fact, people who were in those positions had a set of norms and a set of responsibilities. They had something to lose. So as a result, maybe they were more responsible in certain respects, at the cost, of course, of accessibility and inclusion. So if you really do believe in accessibility and inclusion in the sense that we shouldn't have basically the New York Times reporters, for all the wonderful things that many do, have this extraordinary access that none of the rest of us have, then I think we have to deal with that.
So, Rick, you had a kind of a Downer Debbie laundry list. And how about fixing any of these things? They do seem awfully intractable.
Well, I don't think the choice is between free speech and confronting some of the effects that a massively powerful new set of communications tools present. I don't think that you sacrifice free speech in the course of determining that we've got to build up some new sort of societal immune system responses to fake propaganda campaigns, to foreign influence in our elections, to things that don't just have the consequence of being speech you don't like, but that could have the consequence of being communications and information warfare that fundamentally alters the political ground game and ground state of our country. I mean, we have got people right now who are being fed a very steady diet. And it's the right of Fox News to say whatever they want to say under the First Amendment. I have no problem with them saying what they want to say. But they are training a cadre of people right now. They're convincing a generation of Americans that authoritarian nationalism is the new hot flavor. And there are things that are going to happen because of these consequences of this that I think we have to build. There has to be a response in the market sector, and there has to be a response, and forgive me as a libertarian-leaning guy, there has to be a response in the regulatory space to some of the ways that people's data is handled, some of the ways that this, to loop back for 1 second, people are pretty explicable. It doesn't take a lot of data points to understand who a person is anymore. And those things have become cheaper and cheaper, easier and easier to get. And the consequences that this amazing tool set has given companies and campaigns and overseas powers to use on individuals and on groups is something, like I said, I think we've got to build up a sort of multi-tiered response that doesn't have anything to do with restricting speech, but has a lot to do with educating people about the waters they're swimming in now, and on how institutions respond to some of these challenges that we're seeing. And then we're living through them right now. We're playing 2016 all over again with a lot of people who are fairly gullible and fairly low information voters being told that this is an existential choice between Donald Trump and the apocalypse. So I think we've got to do a lot more work as a society and in the market space to address some of these things.
So I am going to, before I ask Molly a YouTube-related question, I'm going to pose a question to Eugene from the audience, and I'll read it to you, Eugene. Don't get nervous. Mark Zuckerberg talked about the Fifth Estate in his Senate hearing. I would love to hear Eugene's opinion on this.
I am skeptical of powerful institutions. I'm skeptical of those who are skeptical of powerful institutions. I try to be skeptical of everyone. I will say though, that if what we're hoping is that Facebook and YouTube try to fight whatever it is that we think they should be fighting, one question is, why should we trust them so much? Maybe it's in the cause of fighting authoritarian nationalism. Well, I think it's an interesting question. How much nationalism do we want to have? I actually tend to be kind of skeptical about nationalism, but it's an important debate. And actually, lots of people all over the world believe in nationalism. Many in America do. And if we were to try to delegate to Facebook the power to try to fight authoritarian nationalism, I'd be pretty hesitant to doing that. Likewise, when you talk about authoritarianism, and I realize I may be responding more to you than Mark Zuckerberg, but in a sense, I think it's important to get a particular concrete example. I don't actually think that Fox News promotes authoritarianism in the sense of Hitlerism or Stalinism or even Putinism. What it does is it passes certain judgments on certain questions having to do with everything from civil liberties to immigration to various other things that some people don't like. I don't like much of it, but again, I don't want to be in a position where it's Facebook's job to try to do that. One way of thinking about it is, imagine somebody said it's horrible that people are spreading all sorts of evil ideas through email. So I think Google, which runs Gmail, ought to set up filters to make sure that people don't libel each other through Gmail or don't spread or weaponize evil ideas or foreign influence. I think we'd be pretty skeptical. I'm pretty skeptical about Facebook and
Okay, Judy wants to jump in there.
I just want to, and I would love to go on and on, but
You can't.
The problem here is that, and I said something about there's a power imbalance and there's an illusion going on here. You can say you don't want to give the power to the platforms or to Facebook. We have given it to them. So let's acknowledge that they are at the control center of our information distribution. And it's not just Facebook. It is the platform paradigm is controlling us. This whole fifth estate thing, excuse me, is bullpucky, I'll say it that way, in the illusion of it being free while they are manipulating, whether it is purposefully or not, manipulating by the way information is disseminated, by the way the centralization, how centralized it is. And the problem is, if we're going to explicitly give someone power, then they need to take the responsibility of that power. At least the gatekeepers that you don't like at the New York Times or all of these other institutions that we want to get rid of, take responsibility. So if you're going to take the authority, take some responsibility, and we have a complete separation now between power and responsibility.
So should Gmail have the responsibility?
No, I don't want to argue the specific things, because we have to take a step back and look at the structure of how these technology systems have evolved. They are too concentrated, too big, so I can argue the specifics of it. I don't think, and I think Gmail is different than Fox, and I think it's different than social media. I think there's a lot of nuance here to how these things work, and it's really easy to say don't do anything by picking examples that scare us into thinking that we're going to lose our freedoms. But we have serious problems in which now we need to start thinking about. That's why I said you have to think about where you're willing to accept from friction in order to have democracy and an interconnected society.
Okay, I'm going to weave a question from the audience into a follow-up that involves, that is addressed at both Rick and Eugene. Why are the bad actors so much more effective at exploiting free speech?
What does it mean to exploit free speech as opposed to use free speech? And why would we think that bad actors are more effective?
Maybe they mean, I don't know who asked the question, but being so effective with their...
Why would you think that? I mean, let's say, for example, you think that the political right in America are bad actors. Let's assume that, if that's your view. Well, in fact, actually, you look at the last election, and the political left was actually somewhat more effective at taking advantage of free speech to get people elected. You look at states, and it actually varies from state to state. Why should we think? Now, if by exploit you mean use badly, then almost by definition, bad actors are going to be more likely to use free speech badly, right? But if what you mean is, why is my side losing and your side winning? Well, the answer is actually, whatever side you think is right, both are winning some of the time and losing some of the time, right?
We have to ask Rick about this, because Rick, I'm curious. Was it a reason that had to do with the internet that made you come over, or rather go, or just switch? Let's say switch parties.
So I spent 30 years being a political consultant, and my grandmother used to say false modesty is the worst kind. I was really good at what I did. And I did some very controversial things. And I was willing to press the throttle all the way up to the firewall and right up to the line, to the legal limit. And all right. And engage in political speech and help my candidates engage in political speech that won a lot of elections. Now, winning those elections was still using a set of tools largely that we all understand, that we all understood that were fairly explicable to the average person. Right now, people are being readily manipulated, and the big platforms are monetizing that manipulation to the tune of many, many zeros in ways that are not explicable. Manipulations that are not attempting to achieve a free speech result or a political persuasion result, but to divide and to shape a different kind of political character in our country that I think is enormously concerning. And why I switched over to opposing Donald Trump from where I had been in the Republican Party in the traditional mold, well, because I didn't look at him as actually, I came up through the George H.W. Bush era, the old school, old guard, old-fashioned Republican that didn't believe that the rule of law was optional, that didn't believe that the presidential oath of office was me, me, me. So all those things that drove me to change, in part, the revelation that technology was fundamentally altering our politics was certainly underneath that, and that the scale questions and the inexplicability of the tools being used to move people for average voters, they don't stand a really solid chance anymore. They don't have a moment where they can discern truth and fiction in a way, because we've lost a lot of the mediating institutions that used to allow them to do that. And again, it's not an argument to restrict free speech. It's an argument that we have to, as a culture and a society and a country, build up a set of different emotional and intellectual and institutional responses to these things.
Yeah, so should we all, every day, make ourselves read something that we might not agree, go to a website that we might not agree with?
Well, a big feature of these giant platforms is they are feeding you algorithmically driven things to put you in a silo. They want to keep you in one set of news, and so everybody's crazy uncle who's looking at QAnon crap on Facebook starts to believe it because it's all he sees. It's all that it becomes the entire, media universe of a lot of people. These things that narrowly craft people into one hole, I think are, again, it's part of the monetization process. It's part of the algorithmic drivers underneath it. It doesn't have to make it a good thing.
All right, we're going to switch gears a bit and go to Molly. Here's a question from the audience, Molly. How do you feel about the restrictions placed on content creators by threatening their livelihoods if they don't live up to specific censorship standards, especially as YouTube has no real competitors?
Yeah, absolutely. In my industry, we call it adpocalypse.
You call it?
Adpocalypse.
Oh, adpocalypse.
Yes, our ads were restricted if we talked about certain topics that were outside of what they wanted us to speak about. So, in a sense, restricting free speech on YouTube because they wanted to keep their advertisers. Mm-hmm. Because that's ultimately how YouTube makes money from us. I was never affected because I am one of the very brand-friendly creators on the platform. Despite the fact that my audience is mainly 18 to 35, I don't swear, I don't talk about anything controversial, because that's just not what I'm there to do. But I've seen many of my friends, many of my fellow influencers be very affected by it and have to turn to other revenue streams, to other sources, like Patreon, where they can create private content that people pay for, and things like that. I understand both sides of the coin. Unfortunately, a lot of people kind of over the age of 30 are very unaware of everything happening in the sphere of social media influencer. The amount of people I meet when I say, oh, I'm a YouTuber, and they go, oh, my kid's a YouTuber. And I'm like, oh, what's their channel? What are they doing? They're like, no, they watch YouTube. I'm like, did you think I told you my job is watching YouTube? So there's so many people that are completely unaware, and the only thing they ever hear about is when mainstream media publicizes something horrendous that a YouTuber has done, like, exploiting a man's suicide for views. And so it's very unfortunate that kind of the good guys on the internet don't get as much recognition because, as you were saying, communities like mine we're extremely underrepresented still, but the fact that when I started my content 5 years ago, I was one of 5 disabled creators, and only one had over 100,000 followers, and now I'm one of the largest disabled creators on the internet with 3 million followers. It's allowed my community such access to spread information, to gain representation, to break barriers and stigma and stereotypes, change misconceptions that we were never given the opportunity to have before.
Well, that's a wonderful, and I have to say, that's a very optimistic note to end on, and I think Gallup agrees. He just gave a little sigh. So thank you very much, everybody. That was a wide-ranging conversation. And now we're going to our next polling question.
We are. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, panelists.
It was wonderful to have you on the panel.
So, quick show of hands. There were two of these questions asked. How many folks in the room, just by show of hands, are having difficulty distinguishing fact from fiction online? If you are having difficulty, raise your hand. It's really hard for me to see how many. Okay. How many are not having difficulty? About 50-50. Okay. Here is our actual poll question, however, is do the internet giants, the same ones we referred to earlier, take sufficient responsibility for their cultural, societal, business, and political impact? I don't know. Should we give this one more time? Okay, pretty clear. Thank you.